Hello YouTubers, this is GoldStandard00924 coming at you with another WrestleMania archival review. So originally I was going to end it at 17 since that was really where the Attitude Era ended. So I was kind of fluctuating back and forth whether that or WrestleMania 18 would be the final archival review, at least for this year. So I kind of gave it a lot of thought, and I just couldn't help but rewatch this WrestleMania pay per view. It's really been a long time since I watched this. Since I remember getting it on pay per view. So I mean, WrestleMania 18. As a show overall, you had like about 11 matches on the card, which is basically the same amount that you had from the previous WrestleMania. And the overall my overall thoughts on this show, just really a show that you expected a little more than what you had. I mean, WWE by this point had such a massive roster, and that can be explained when they purchased WCW and ECW. So apparently, the invasion happened around the summer and fall of 2001, and it wasn't really well received. It got a lot of criticism, with the fact that a lot of these WCW, ECW guys just weren't on par with the star power that the WWE had, and you add to that there were like certain main eventers from their rival companies that didn't participate in the particular invasion angle. So ever since then, I mean, it's really widely panned. It's got a lot of criticism over the years, and and then they pretty much ended the invasion angle at Survivor Series. So then, Ric Flair came back the next night, and Vince McMahon, they started this whole 50-50 ownership, and eventually, the next couple months go by, and then you get to like WrestleMania 18. It's really showing you just a show that it just really felt that there could have been so much more. I mean, I enjoyed it as a kid, but looking back, just a show that was really unmemorable. It wasn't anything terrible, maybe except for one or two matches on here. But most of the undercard matches just felt really average. There were certain talent on the roster that could have been utilized better or utilized to take on a better opponent. Um, but to get into detail, I'm just gonna run down the match cards here. So you have the first match on here. You had the Intercontinental title. So you had Rob Van Dam going in as the champ, defending the belt against William Regal. So a match that didn't really last very long. It was still a watchable match. Nothing too spectacular. There was like a sixth spot where William Regal did like a half Nelson suplex, and Rob Van Dam landed pretty hard on the back of his neck. So yeah, that was a pretty shocker at the time. But luckily RVD managed to recover from that, and basically won the match with the 5-star frog splash. So RVD retained the IC title. The match didn't last very long, like I said. It's kind of a coincidence that William Regal not only had to open up the pay-per-view 2 times in a row, but also going after the Intercontinental title only to come up short. So so 17 he fought Chris Jericho and he lost that, and then Regal fought RVD at the next year's WrestleMania, and then once again Regal came up short in that match. So it's a pretty subtle coincidence. But yeah, this was a really okay match. Nothing really to write home about, maybe aside from that sixth spot that Regal did. So I mean, it was an okay match, but nothing too groundbreaking or anything. Then we have is the European title. You have the champion Diamond Dallas Page defending the belt against Christian. Just like the first match, just a pretty okay match, very watchable. I did remember that the build up to this, because they were doing this whole thing where Christian was starting to get this temper tantrum. Like anytime he lost a match, he would just lose his temper. And then Diamond Dallas Page had this gimmick where He's really trying to kind of help Christian out, and having this whole catchphrase being that if that's not a bad thing, then it's a good thing. So so basically, DDP and Christian had this sort of unusual partnership, and then Christian turned on DDP, and this kind of led to this little feud here. Yeah, so that was an okay match, like I said. My favorite moment was DDP trying to go for a diamond cutter, and then Christian reversing it into a reverse DDT. There was like a lot of counters towards the end, like DDP going for like a small package, and Christian countering that, kicking out for that matter. Yeah, so like Christian also went for Unprettier, DDP reversed, and eventually Christian kind of tries his best to avoid losing his temper, and then eventually out of nowhere DDP just nailed the diamond cutter, so DDP won the match. Yeah, so I mean, like I said, just a really okay match. It's kind of really a shame the way WWE treated Diamond Dallas Page at the time, because in WCW, he was this big star. I mean, he was feuding with guys like Macho Man Randy Savage and Raven and Goldberg as well. And then he went to the WWE, and he just wasn't getting the same success that he had. Like he started off strong, feuding, having this little feud with the Undertaker, but problem was they never really had a proper match. I mean, they had like a confrontation at King of the Ring, and then there was like one episode of Raw where DDP lost to Undertaker's ex-wife Sarah, and yeah, that just really created a lot of backlash. Yeah, so Undertaker's ex-wife Sarah, they're not married anymore, and Undertaker's with Michelle McCool now. But getting back to DDP versus Christian, yeah, just a really okay match. I mean, nothing too spectacular, but nothing too terrible either. But it's better than nothing that DDP at least wrestled at a WrestleMania. So I guess it's better than nothing, like I said. But it was an okay match. And then we have is the hardcore title match. We have the champion Maven taking on Goldust. Not really much to say here, since I mean there was really no decisive victor. This is the hardcore title. No DQ. They still have the 24/7 rule still going on. So basically, Maven and Goldust, they brawled mostly at ringside for a little bit, and then Maven and Goldust whacked each other with steel trays, and both of them went down. So eventually, Spike Dudley out of nowhere interferes in the match and pins Maven to become the hardcore champion. And then Crash Holly came out, and then he and Spike Dudley were chasing through the crowd. And then there was like a couple of moments where Al Snow was riding on a golf cart, I believe, and then he crashed like into these crates of boxes. So yeah, that was a pretty funny moment. So eventually, Hurricane won the hardcore title. Typical superhero entrance. Yeah, and there was like a lot of other title changes, like Hurricane's then sidekick Molly Holly winning the belt, and then Christian winning it, and then by the end of the night, Maven won the title back. So yeah, I mean, there was just a lot of hardcore madness going on throughout the pay-per-view. It's really kind of a shame, because a lot of the hardcore title matches just were a lot more memorable compared to a lot of the undercard matches, and aside from maybe like one or two matches that stood out, I mean, the only things I could remember was like the hardcore title changes. Yeah, so Maven versus Goldust is going to get an NA. I mean, it was not applicable. Match wasn't really a match because none of them came off as a victor, but obviously Maven ended up winning the belt back by the end of the night. So yeah, it was mostly in between segments. So it wasn't really much of a match. So not applicable at best. So then you have Kurt Angle taking on Kane. Yeah, I mean, this match, I don't think it really had any build-up, at least I can remember. But basically, those two guys just didn't really have anyone to feud with, so they just put those two and two together. Kurt Angle came off of a miracle year in 2001, winning the world title, but despite that, Kurt Angle just went back to the mid card, and Kane was just kind of Kane. I mean, didn't really had any feuds in particular. So yeah, I mean, normally I would just go into detail with a lot of these matches, but just there wasn't really anything much to talk about. But the match ended when Kurt Angle tried to counter a choke slam and reversed it into a well, not a small package, but just a regular roll up. So Kurt Angle beat Kane with a roll up. Yeah, just a match that was just kind of average, just kind of there to pass the time. Yeah, so there wasn't really much to say. Kurt Angle should have been in a bigger role, but that's just my personal opinion. So Kurt Angle went over Kane in a okay match, but a little disappointing. Then we have is the first marquee match. We have a no DQ match between The Undertaker and Ric Flair. So apparently, Ric Flair came back the night after the Invasion angle ended. So it was the night after Survivor Series. And, he came back in his hometown, Charlotte, North Carolina. And eventually he was announced to be a co-owner of the WWE. Or WWF at the time. So eventually him and Vince McMahon had this 50-50 ownership. And then there was like a match at No Way Out where Ric Flair interfered between The Rock and The Undertaker. And then Undertaker lost to The Rock, I believe. So eventually Ric Flair and Undertaker started having some heated rivalry going on. And then there was like times where Undertaker attacked Arn Anderson. And then he also attacked Ric Flair's son, David Flair. Yeah, so this kind of led to this little match here. I wouldn't say little, but this is actually a marquee match that I think it kind of gets forgotten as well. I mean, I remember enjoying this match, but I mean, ever since then I just ended up forgetting it because of the other match that ended up stealing the show. So I'll get a little bit more into that. But getting back to Undertaker and Ric Flair, I mean, it was still a pretty great match, but, often gets forgotten because of, icon versus icon. So, yeah, there was some pretty good back and forth, a lot of brawling. Ric Flair, blading just as usual. Yeah, and I really liked the interference from Arn Anderson. So that was pretty cool. So eventually, Undertaker still won the match. He beat Ric Flair with the Tombstone Piledriver. So eventually, Undertaker won the match, and thus making him 10-0. And this is really from that point onwards where the announcers started really heavily emphasizing on Undertaker's WrestleMania streak, and it's still going on to this day. So yeah, I mean, they just really made a big deal out of it, and Undertaker went over Flair. Yeah, so it's a pretty great match. Undertaker's heel run was pretty enjoyable for the time, but obviously that didn't last long. So I mean, it was still a pretty good match. Yeah, so what more can I say? Then we have is a match between Edge and Booker T. And basically the build-up was really stupid looking back on it. So apparently they were fighting over a Japanese commercial or a Japanese shampoo. So obviously you never really saw the Japanese shampoo commercial. So yeah, they were fighting over some stupid commercial that you never really saw. And it was kind of an excuse to get these guys on the card. I mean, this match was kind of alright, but it's mostly a TV quality match. So I mean, eventually, yeah, there's some pretty cool moments. Booker T doing the spinneroonie and Edge mocking Booker T with the spinneroonie as well. Yeah, so I mean, the match was okay. It didn't last very long. So like, Booker T went for a scissors kick. Edge actually winning with the Edgecution DDT. So yeah, so it was pretty unusual for Edge to win with the Edgecution, because mostly during his singles run he would always win with the spear. But But yeah, so I think around this time, Edge started winning matches with the DDT. But yeah, so Edge beat Booker T. Just the okay match at best, but nothing. Like I said, nothing really too spectacular. So yeah, there you have it. Then we have is Stone Cold Steve Austin taking on Scott Hall. This really shows just how much Stone Cold has fallen. So eventually, this is the guy that was your top face of the company, feuding with guys like Bret Hart and, winning WWF title from Shawn Michaels and, having a 2 series of matches with The Rock prior to this. And then out of all guys that Stone Cold had at WrestleMania, you had Scott Hall. So apparently Stone Cold and Scott Hall, this was basically a one-sided feud. And I remember there was video packages where Stone Cold shoots Scott Hall and Kevin Nash with a net. And then there was times where Scott Hall got kidnapped by Stone Cold. And he was basically annihilating the NWO. Like they were just a generic, random, average stable. And to think the NWO was the same faction or stable that took over WCW, that were beating up the Dungeon of Doom, that were just laying the smackdown before The Rock was laying the smackdown on a lot of the WCW roster. And you're telling me that the NWO can't even lay a hand on Stone Cold? Like, seriously? So Stone Cold and Scott Hall had a match. Kevin Nash was accompanying Scott Hall. So eventually, just some back and forth here and there. There was a ref bump along the way. And then you had these horde of referees coming out to escort Kevin Nash out of the arena. So eventually Stone Cold took him a lot of Stone Cold stunners on Scott Hall. And a lot of people remember that ending where Stone Cold, the way that Scott Hall sold the Stone Cold stunner, where he was just flying up in the air. So yeah, that was pretty funny stuff, but still pretty cool looking at it. But a lot of people remember it for that. And Stone Cold beat Scott Hall. Yeah, this is a really terrible match. Just really showed just how much Stone Cold has fallen. And it wasn't until several months later where he walked out of the company. And then, the next year he fought against The Rock in what would turn out to be his last match. Yeah, so this was a really terrible match. Originally Stone Cold was supposed to fight Hulk Hogan, but apparently neither guy could agree on who should go over. So eventually, because things weren't working out between those two, eventually The Rock took over Stone Cold's spot. Yeah, just Steve Austin, Scott Hall, just a horrible opponent choice and a really underwhelming match, just to really put it at best. So just a pretty terrible match overall. And then we have is the Four Corners elimination match for the tag team titles. So you have Billy Gunn and Chuck Palumbo defending the belts against the APA, the Hardys, and the Dudleys. Gosh, the Billy and Chuck gimmick. Oh man. So apparently they were given this homosexual gimmick, and where those two guys were really into each other, and eventually they have this sort of Four Corners match. APA were the first ones eliminated. There was actually a pretty almost accidental bump where Bradshaw was going for a clothesline from hell, but he almost bumped into Bubba Ray Dudley. I think he was trying to get back on the apron because he already tagged. So eventually, the APA were the first one eliminated. There was a moment where during the Hardys Dudleys standoff where Jeff Hardy slapped Stacy Keibler's ass. So that was a pretty notable moment there. I think Bubba Ray Dudley crashed onto the regular table that they brought out from under the ring. And so the Dudleys ended up getting eliminated. And then so it was down to Hardys and Billy and Chuck. So eventually Billy and Chuck won when Billy Gunn clubbed Jeff Hardy with the tag title belt. So eventually Billy and Chuck retained the tag titles. Yeah, this match was okay. It's kind of a what am I looking for? Kind of a step down from the previous tag title match from WrestleMania's 2017. So like the Hardys and Dudleys were in the TLC match, so they went from that to just a regular standard match. I guess it's kind of understandable, because there were so many star power. There was just a lot of other matches that were going on, and surprising enough, the tag title match actually ran longer than the other undercard matches. So I think that should be saying much, but the match was just kind of there. So Billy and Chuck retained the tag titles. Just an okay match, just kind of there. So then we get to the other marquee match that a lot of people talk about to this day, and this one was the Icon versus Icon match between The Rock and Hollywood Hulk Hogan. So when I watched this match, the atmosphere was still pretty great. This was at the Toronto Skydome with where the atmosphere was really huge. So yeah, Hulk Hogan surprisingly got some really positive pops, and The Rock, despite being the babyface, is getting booed. Yeah, I was really shocked at the time because this is one of the early cases where I was surprised as to why they were booing a babyface. They were doing this stuff even back in the day when Hogan got booed when he went to WCW, but then he came back to the WWE. He was getting a lot of massive crowd reactions, massive pops. So yeah, I was kind of shocked because I remember my sister was cheering for Hogan and I was cheering for Rock. Yeah, this was kind of a shocker, and even the build-up, despite the fact that the NWO tried to murder The Rock. I think there was a moment on Raw or SmackDown where they were trying to run over The Rock when he was stuck in this vehicle, and then I think it was a truck or a vehicle, and they crashed onto another vehicle that The Rock was in. Yeah, so they try to commit murder here, but then all of a sudden Hulk Hogan gets cheered. So yeah, and I think this what makes it even more confusing, or at least a little messed up. But for what it was, Rock and Hogan was actually a really great match. Yeah, Hogan actually had a lot of offense. Rock was really was coming off as a heel, really trying to play off the crowd. And the emotion, the stare down, was really iconic. And Rock won with the rock bottom people's elbow combination. So he won that match. Yeah, so eventually, like I said, when the NWO stuff, Hogan and Hall and Nash try to murder The Rock, and then all of a sudden Rock and Hogan are shaking hands. So that was really weird, at least for me back then when I watched it. And then there was a little aftermath when the Outsiders came out and they were arguing with Hulk Hogan. So eventually this kind of leads to this 2-on-1 beatdown. And then The Rock came back and saved Hulk Hogan. So yeah, so they ended the aftermath with a little bit of celebration time. So, but The Rock and Hulk Hogan, just a really great match. Yeah, there hasn't really been a match on the card that could really rival it, maybe except Undertaker and Ric Flair. But even the no DQ match with Taker and Flair kind of gets forgotten or swept under the rug. Yeah, but Rock and Hogan, for what it was a really great match. The atmosphere, the crowd was really extraordinary. So yeah, so Rock and Hogan, definitely the match of the night. Then we have is a little filler match with the triple threat match for the women's title. So you have the champion Jazz defending the belt against Lita and Trish Stratus. Match wasn't really that long. Trish Stratus got hurt really bad, as a result of that kick that Jazz did. So for most of the match, Trish Stratus was pretty much out, and she was hanging at ringside. She had a little offense towards the end, but for the most part, it was really Jazz and Lita going at it. yeah, so eventually Jazz won when she did that super fisherman suplex from the top rope on Lita. So basically, Jazz retained the title. Um, yeah, so like I said, not a very long match. I don't understand why they didn't make Trish Stratus win, despite the fact this was in her home country of Canada. Um, yeah, so I never really understood that. Then again, I mean, maybe Trish Stratus was pretty hurt during that match. But yeah, so Jazz retained the women's title. Just not a really great match, or good for that matter. Um, yeah, so just not a match I would recommend. So then we have is the main event. So you have the undisputed championship on the line. So you have Chris Jericho defending the belt against Triple H. Um, I mean, the build-up was just really terrible. So apparently, I mean, it started off fine at first when they brought up the fact that Jericho took out Triple H, and because he locked in the walls of Jericho, so Triple H ended up getting injured and out of action. So basically, because of the quad tear, Triple H had to be out of action throughout most of the invasion angle and all of 2001. And then, he came back on the first Raw of 2002 in Madison Square Garden and got this really big pop, a really big ovation, and, won the Royal Rumble. And then, Chris Jericho won the Undisputed title by beating Stone Cold and The Rock at Vengeance. So, eventually, he's been holding that belt since December, and then, going into WrestleMania 18. Now, the problem with the build-up was the fact that, I mean, they brought in Stephanie McMahon. They were doing this whole thing of whether or not Triple H and Stephanie were going to renew their wedding vows. And then there was, like, a lot of stuff that was going on, and I think there was, like, a lot of... It just really made Chris Jericho look like a doofus. So he had to take care of a dog, and then... Triple H and Stephanie was pretty much the whole central focus. And then you had the match, which wasn't all that bad, but, I mean, it had to really try to live up to, what Rock and Hogan had. Because when you think of WrestleMania 18, you don't talk about Triple H and Chris Jericho and how awesome it was, but then you also had people talking about Icon versus Icon, because a lot of people thought at the time that was going to be the match to close out the show. And it could be determined or judged by a lot of the flyers, a lot of the posters. So when like WrestleMania 18 posters came out, the first thing that you saw was Rock and Hogan, and they were making such a big deal out of that. So the fact that it wasn't a part of the last match was kind of really questionable at the time, and eventually Jericho and Triple H were the last match, and the crowd was just so burnt out. I mean, the match, like I said, wasn't all that bad. Triple H tried to go for like a figure four, and then like Stephanie McMahon raked Triple H's eyes with her fingernails. There was a couple announce table spots. Yeah, I think either Jericho or Triple H crashed on the announce table. And Jericho also did like a figure four on the ring post. So it's kind of like paying homage to like Bret Hart, since he was also trained in the Stu Hart dungeon. Let's see what I can remember. And then, Stephanie McMahon had so much involvement in the match. So, Triple H pedigreed Stephanie McMahon. And then the match ended when Jericho tried to go for a missile drop kick, and then Triple H went for a pedigree and won the undisputed title there. So the match, just a pretty good match. Nothing too special about it. I think everyone knew that Triple H was obviously going to win, judging by the story and the fact that Triple H came back from an injury. So obviously, it was pretty clear that Triple H was going to win the world title. And it was kind of a shame, well, not because of Triple H, but he didn't hold the title for very long, and he lost the belt the next month to Hulk Hogan at Backlash. But yeah, so Triple H, kind of got the short end of the stick at first, because he kind of got overshadowed with a lot of the Rock and Hulk Hogan, and you know, and just really kind of like the sidekick to the main attraction. Um, and it wasn't until like the end of 2002 when he was handed the world title, and then 2003 and having this long ass title reign. So I guess it was kind of to compensate over the Triple H's lack of world title reign that he had here. So yeah, so Triple H beat Jericho, and Jericho just kind of went back to the mid card, and they had like a Hell in a Cell match a few months later at Judgment Day, which was really underrated that no one really talks about. Yeah, so I mean Jericho Triple H, for WrestleMania 18, just a pretty good match at best. Yeah, so yeah, Triple H won the world title there. So WrestleMania 18 in closing, just a show that isn't really all that memorable. I mean, a lot of people talk about Rock and Hogan. That was pretty much the match that really blew away the crowd. Undertaker Ric Flair was pretty cool, but even that match kind of gets swept under the rug nowadays. Yeah, so I mean, that Undertaker Ric Flair was probably the only other match that night that could rival Rock and Hogan. The rest of the undercard was really forgettable. The hardcore title changes were the only things that were more memorable than any of the other undercard matches on here. Stone Cold got stuck with feuding with a wrestler that was kind of there. A match that you would see on like Monday Night Raw or SmackDown. Yeah, it's kind of really a shame how Stone Cold kind of fell throughout 2002. Triple Threat Women's Title match was kind of terrible. Four Corners match was kind of disappointing. And the fact that APA, the Hardys, and the Dudleys end up breaking up not long after this. Yeah, I mean, this WrestleMania, just very disappointing. I mean, this was the last WrestleMania with the WWF name, because not long after this, the World Wildlife Fund sued the World Wrestling Federation, and as a result, the World Wrestling Federation became World Wrestling Entertainment, or WWE as we know it now. And then there was just so much change that was going on in the company. And, by the end of 2002, Rock and Austin were pretty much gone. They were focusing more on, the in-ring work, and, guys like Brock Lesnar and Randy Orton, John Cena, a lot of the OVW wrestlers coming into the WWE. And obviously the brand extension. How could I forget about that? Yeah, so WrestleMania 18, just a very disappointing pay-per-view. It really goes to show you just how much of a massive roster WWE had at the time, but most of them were just kind of underutilized. It's kind of a shame, but then again, I mean, you just can't really change the past. But, I mean, WrestleMania 18 wasn't like a terrible pay-per-view, but it wasn't all that spectacular. It's kind of really a bit of a letdown compared to what 17 had to offer, and I think that might have been the pressure that was going on with WrestleMania 18. And this was like 5 months of endless, directionless pattern for the WWE, and it's just really disappointing and sad. But yeah, so for some recommended matches, I would recommend Undertaker Ric Flair, as well as The Rock versus Hulk Hogan. Rest of the card just pretty forgettable. The world title between Jericho and Triple H was good, but not good enough for a WrestleMania event. So yeah, there you have it. That. So thank you all for watching. I apologize for it being a long video, but I hope you're sticking around. Yeah, so this is pretty much it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Till next time, Gold Standard Caesar 924 signing